The clock had just struck 11:30 p.m. in the quiet suburbs of Silver Ridge, where perfectly manicured lawns stretched before grand houses with their warmly lit windows. Agent Michelle Davis was driving her unmarked black sedan through the neighborhood, her mind still processing the details of the complex operation she'd wrapped up just an hour ago. After 15 years with the FBI, nights like these were routine, but they never got less demanding. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional cat darting across perfectly paved roads. Michelle adjusted her rearview mirror, catching sight of headlights that had been following her for the past few minutes. Her trained instincts kicked in, noting how the vehicle maintained the same distance, turning wherever she turned. She wasn't particularly worried. This was one of the safest neighborhoods in town. The red and blue lights suddenly flashed behind her, reflecting off her mirror. Michelle checked her speedometer. She'd been going exactly at the limit. Years of law enforcement experience had taught her to always drive by the book, especially during late hours. She signaled and pulled over smoothly, positioning her car safely by the curb. Through her side mirror, she watched as the police officer stepped out of his patrol car. Officer Robert Thompson had been with the local force for 8 years, and this wasn't his first late-night patrol in Silver Ridge. He adjusted his belt and straightened his cap, his hand casually resting near his holster, a habit he developed over years of traffic stops. Michelle rolled down her window, keeping both hands visible on the steering wheel. Another habit from years of training. The cool night air carried the scent of blooming jasmine from nearby gardens. She could hear crickets chirping in the distance, their song interrupted by the officer's heavy footsteps approaching her car. License and registration. Officer Thompson demanded, his flashlight beam dancing across her face, then sweeping through her car's interior. His tone carried an edge that seemed unnecessary for a routine traffic stop. "Good evening, officer," Michelle replied calmly. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Officer Thompson's posture stiffened. "You looked suspicious circling the neighborhood. This is a high-end area." His flashlight beam lingered on her face, then swept across her professional attire, a navy blazer over a white blouse. "I was just driving home, officer," Michelle explained, maintaining her composure. "I live a few blocks from here." "Sure you do." Officer Thompson scoffed, his disbelief evident in his tone. "Step out of the vehicle." Michelle's mind raced through protocol and procedure, both as a law enforcement officer and as a citizen who knew her rights. "Officer, I haven't committed any traffic violation. Is there a specific reason you're asking me to exit my vehicle?" The situation was escalating unnecessarily, and Michelle could feel it. The crickets had gone quiet, as if they too were watching the scene unfold. In the distance, a dog barked, breaking the tension momentarily. "I said, step out of the vehicle," Officer Thompson repeated, his hand now firmly gripping his holster. The friendly suburban night had suddenly taken on a darker tone. Michelle knew that what happened next would be crucial. As both an FBI agent and a citizen, she had to handle this situation carefully. Years of training in de-escalation and conflict resolution were about to be put to an unexpected test, right here in this peaceful neighborhood where million-dollar homes stood as silent witnesses to what was unfolding. The implications of this moment weren't lost on her. This was exactly the kind of situation she'd investigated countless times from the other side. Now she found herself living it, and her response would matter not just for her safety, but for the larger issues this encounter represented. Officer Thompson's flashlight beam cut through the darkness like a sword, creating harsh shadows across the car's interior. Michelle slowly reached for her seatbelt, making sure her movements were deliberate and visible. The sound of the buckle clicking seemed unusually loud in the tense silence. "I'm going to step out now," she announced clearly, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the growing knot in her stomach. The car door creaked as she opened it, the sound echoing off the perfectly maintained facades of nearby homes. A porch light flicked on in a house across the street. Someone was watching. The night air had grown cooler, and Michelle could feel goosebumps rising on her arms as she stood facing the officer. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she straightened up, standing tall despite the clear intimidation tactics being used against her. "Put your hands where I can see them," Officer Thompson barked, his own hand still hovering near his weapon. His stance was aggressive, feet planted wide, as if preparing for a confrontation that existed only in his mind. "Officer, I want to cooperate fully," Michelle said, her voice steady and clear, the same voice she used when training new agents in de-escalation techniques. "But I need to understand why I'm being detained." The officer's response came quick and sharp. "You fit the description of a suspicious person reported in the area." His words hung in the air, both of them knowing how hollow they sounded. No such report had been called in that night. A gentle breeze rustled through the perfectly trimmed hedges lining the street, carrying with it the distant sound of late-night traffic from the highway. Michelle's thoughts turned briefly to her badge and credentials in her purse on the passenger seat, just a few feet away, but might as well have been miles. "I'd like to show you my identification," she said calmly, gesturing slowly toward the car. "It's in my purse on the passenger seat." "Don't move." Officer Thompson's voice cracked like a whip. His hand was now fully on his weapon. "Face the vehicle and place your hands on the hood." The cold metal of the car hood pressed against Michelle's palms as she complied. Her years of training were screaming at her to identify herself as a federal agent, but her experience told her that any sudden movements or unexpected declarations might escalate the situation further. From somewhere nearby, a car door shut quietly. More neighbors were watching now. The sound of a phone camera clicking carried through the still night air. This incident wouldn't go unnoticed or undocumented. "Officer, I'm a federal," she began, but was cut off by the rough handling as Officer Thompson began patting her down. "You have the right to remain silent," he started, pulling her hands behind her back. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into her wrists. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Michelle felt a mix of emotions: frustration, anger, and an odd sense of professional curiosity about how this would play out. The irony wasn't lost on her. Tomorrow she was supposed to lead a training session on community policing and bias awareness. The handcuffs clicked tight, perhaps tighter than necessary. Officer Thompson's breathing was slightly elevated, betraying his own tension. He hadn't called for backup, hadn't run her plates, hadn't followed any of the standard procedures that should precede an arrest. More lights were coming on in the houses around them. Faces appeared in windows, phones recorded from behind curtains. The peaceful neighborhood had become an audience to this display of power gone wrong. This moment that would soon cascade into consequences neither officer could imagine. As she was led to the patrol car, Michelle caught her reflection in its polished surface. She saw herself as she truly was, not a threat, not a suspicious person, but a highly trained federal agent who would turn this moment into a catalyst for change. The patrol car's door opened with a heavy clunk, and as she was guided inside, she knew this night was far from over. The ride to the police station was silent except for the quiet crackle of the police radio and the hum of tires on asphalt. Michelle sat in the back of the patrol car, her trained mind cataloging every detail of the encounter. The digital clock on the dashboard read 11:52 p.m. Less than 20 minutes had passed since the initial stop, but it felt like hours. Through the partition, she could see Officer Thompson's knuckles white against the steering wheel. His body camera's red light blinked steadily, recording everything. She knew that footage would be important later, but for now, she focused on staying calm and professional. The station came into view. A modern two-story building with bright fluorescent lighting spilling onto the empty parking lot. A few police cars sat idle under the yellow glow of parking lot lights, their metal surfaces reflecting the artificial brightness. The night shift was usually quiet here, but tonight would be different. As Officer Thompson guided her through the station's back entrance, Michelle noticed the surprised looks from other officers. It wasn't every night they saw someone in professional business attire being brought in wearing handcuffs. The click of her heels echoed off the linoleum floors, creating a steady rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Booking room 2. A desk sergeant called out, barely looking up from his computer screen. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as they walked down the corridor, passing other officers who tried to appear busy while stealing curious glances. The booking room was small and sterile, with its gray walls and single metal table bolted to the floor. A camera in the corner watched silently as Officer Thompson directed Michelle to sit. The chair was cold and uncomfortable, designed to be that way. "Now," Officer Thompson said, pulling out a form, "let's start with your name and address." His voice carried a hint of satisfaction, the tone of someone who thought they were in complete control of the situation. Michelle sat up straight, despite her hands still being cuffed behind her back. "Before we continue, I need you to retrieve my credentials from my purse. Front pocket, black leather wallet." "Ma'am, we'll get to your identification after." "My FBI badge is in that wallet," Michelle interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "I suggest you verify that immediately." The officer's pen stopped mid-word. For a moment, the only sound was the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant ringing of a phone somewhere in the building. Officer Thompson's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, doubt, and then the first flicker of concern. "I'll need to confirm that," he said, his voice less certain now. He left the room quickly, leaving Michelle alone under the harsh fluorescent lights. Through the room's thin walls, she could hear hurried conversations and quick footsteps. Word was spreading through the station. She caught fragments of whispered conversations: FBI agent, and traffic stop, and oh no. Minutes ticked by on the wall clock, 5, then 10. Michelle remained perfectly still, her posture professional even with her hands restrained. She'd been on the other side of this table many times, conducting interviews and interrogations. The irony of her current position wasn't lost on her. Finally, the door opened again. Officer Thompson returned, but this time he wasn't alone. The station captain, a middle-aged man with graying temples, entered behind him. The captain's face was a mask of professional concern as he quickly assessed the situation. "Agent, please accept our sincerest apologies," the captain said, moving forward with a key. This is not how we conduct business here." The handcuffs came off with a click, and Michelle slowly brought her hands forward, rubbing her wrists. Her FBI credentials were placed on the table in front of her, the golden badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, a symbol of authority that should have been checked long before things reached this point. Officer Thompson stood in the corner, his earlier confidence completely deflated as the reality of his actions began to sink in. "Captain," Michelle said, standing up and straightening her blazer, "we need to have a serious discussion about tonight's events." Her voice was level, professional, but carried the weight of what was to come. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. This was about to become something much bigger. The captain's office felt worlds away from the booking room's harsh fluorescent lighting. Warm lamplight cast a softer glow over the dark wood desk and filing cabinets. The wall clock showed it was now past midnight, but sleep was the last thing on anyone's mind. Michelle sat across from the captain, her FBI badge now properly displayed on her blazer. A cup of coffee steamed untouched in front of her, a peace offering that couldn't begin to address what had happened. Officer Thompson sat to her right, looking significantly smaller than he had during the traffic stop, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "Let's review the sequence of events," the captain said, his computer monitor reflecting in his reading glasses as he pulled up the body camera footage. The familiar scene began playing out on the screen. Michelle's car, the traffic stop, the escalation that should never have happened. "Stop right there," Michelle said, pointing to a particular moment in the footage. "Officer Thompson, can you explain why you immediately placed your hand on your weapon when approaching my vehicle?" Her voice was steady, professional, the voice of an investigator who'd conducted countless similar reviews. Officer Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The leather squeaked beneath him, breaking the tense silence. I felt the situation was potentially dangerous. Based on what factors? Michelle pressed, though she already knew the answer. The captain leaned forward, his expression growing more concerned as he watched his officer struggle to provide a legitimate reason. The body camera footage continued playing silently in the background. Through the window, they could see other officers gathering in small groups, throwing worried glances toward the captain's office. Word had spread quickly through the night shift about what had happened. "We need to discuss your patrol patterns," Michelle said, pulling out her phone and displaying a map of the area. "The FBI has received multiple complaints about similar stops in this neighborhood over the past 6 months. Would you care to explain that?" The captain's eyebrows shot up. This was clearly news to him. He pulled off his glasses and rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation becoming clearer with each passing minute. A gentle knock on the door interrupted them. The desk surgeon entered with a thick folder. "Sir, I pulled Officer Thompson's stop records as requested." The folder landed on the desk with a heavy thud that seemed to echo the gravity of the moment. Michelle opened the folder, her trained eye quickly scanning the documents inside. Patterns emerged from the data: specific neighborhoods, specific times, specific types of stops. The captain watched her review the information, his face growing more troubled with each page she turned. "In the past 3 months alone," Michelle began, her finger trailing down a page of statistics, "you've conducted 68 traffic stops in predominantly affluent neighborhoods. Can you break down the demographics of those stops for me?" Officer Thompson's face had gone pale. The numbers told a story he couldn't explain away. The safe haven of excuses and procedural justifications he'd built around his actions was crumbling under the weight of hard data. "This goes beyond tonight's incident," Michelle continued, her voice firm but measured. "What happened to me was just one piece of a larger pattern. A pattern that ends now." The captain nodded slowly, already reaching for his phone. "I'll contact Internal Affairs first thing in the morning." "Officer Thompson, consider yourself on administrative leave effective immediately." Outside the office windows, the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky. The night shift would be ending soon, but this was just the beginning. Michelle gathered her documents, knowing that her impromptu late-night drive home had transformed into something much more significant. "I'll need copies of all of these records," she said, standing up. "And Captain, expect a formal request from the FBI's Civil Rights Division by noon today. What happened tonight has opened the door to a much broader investigation." As she left the office, Michelle could feel the weight of every eye in the station following her. She'd walked through these halls countless times as an FBI agent, but never quite like this. Tonight hadn't just been about one traffic stop or one officer. It was about to become a catalyst for real change. The next morning, the police station buzzed with unusual energy. News travels fast in law enforcement circles, and by 9 a.m., the story of last night's incident had spread through every department. Internal Affairs investigators moved through the building like silent shadows, collecting files and conducting interviews. Michelle sat in a conference room at the FBI field office, surrounded by stacks of police reports and data analyses. The wall-mounted screens displayed maps of the city, with red dots marking every questionable traffic stop over the past year. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Clustered primarily in upscale neighborhoods, targeting specific demographics. "The numbers don't lie," said the Internal Affairs chief, an experienced investigator with salt and pepper hair. He pointed to a graph showing escalating statistics. Officer Thompson's stops increased by 200% in these specific areas over the past 6 months. The room was filled with representatives from various departments: Internal Affairs, the Police Commissioner's Office, the FBI's Civil Rights Division, and Community Oversight Board members. Coffee cups and half-eaten breakfast sandwiches littered the table, evidence of the early morning emergency meeting. "What concerns me most," Michelle said, standing to point at one of the screens, "is how these stops were justified in the paperwork. Suspicious behavior is cited in over 80% of these cases, but there's no concrete description of what made the behavior suspicious." The police commissioner, who had rushed back from a conference in another city, leaned forward in his chair. "This could be the tip of the iceberg. We need to review every officer's stop records, not just Thompson's." Outside the conference room windows, they could see news vans gathering in the parking lot. Someone had leaked the story to the media. Phones buzzed constantly with notifications of new articles appearing online. The incident was quickly becoming national news. "We've already received dozens of calls," said a community board member, holding up her tablet. "People are coming forward with similar experiences. They just never had proof before." Her voice carried the weight of years of unheard complaints. Michelle pulled up the body camera footage from her stop, now a crucial piece of evidence. The room fell silent as they watched the interaction unfold. Even veteran officers winced at the clear display of bias and escalation. "Look at the timestamp here," she pointed out. "He didn't run my plates before approaching the vehicle. Standard procedure ignored. And here, no probable cause stated for the arrest. Basic protocols violated at every step." The investigation was expanding beyond one officer or one department. It was revealing systemic issues that had been festering beneath the surface. Maps and data on the screens told a story of unconscious bias turned into conscious action, of power unchecked and accountability ignored. "We've identified at least 30 similar incidents in the past year alone," said an analyst from Internal Affairs, spreading out more reports. "Different officers, same patterns. This isn't isolated." The police commissioner rubbed his temples, the political implications becoming clearer with each revelation. "We need immediate action. New training protocols, review boards, community oversight. Everything has to change." Michelle's phone buzzed. Another call from the media wanting a statement. She ignored it, focusing instead on the task at hand. Her personal experience had opened a door, but what they found behind it was far more significant than one bad traffic stop. "We start with a full audit," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of both her FBI role and her recent experience. "Every traffic stop, every arrest, every complaint for the past 2 years. No stone unturned." The room nodded in agreement. Charts and graphs on the screens painted a clear picture of systemic issues, but it was the human stories behind the data that would drive real change. Each dot on those maps represented someone's son, daughter, parent, or friend who had faced similar treatment. As the meeting continued, more reports arrived. More stories emerged. What had started as one incident in an affluent neighborhood was revealing itself to be a watershed moment for the entire department. The investigation was just beginning, but its ripples were already spreading far beyond that single traffic stop on a quiet suburban street. 2 weeks after the incident, the police department's largest conference room was packed wall to wall with officers, community leaders, and media representatives. The air felt heavy with anticipation as the police commissioner stepped up to the podium, cameras flashing like lightning in a storm. "Today marks a turning point," he began, his voice carrying through the speakers. "The results of our internal investigation have revealed patterns that cannot and will not be ignored." Behind him, a screen displayed statistics and findings that had shocked even the most seasoned officers. Officer Thompson sat in the back row, now in civilian clothes, his face drawn and tired. The investigation had uncovered over 50 similar incidents linked to his patrols alone. Each case had been reviewed, each victim contacted, each report scrutinized under the harsh light of accountability. Michelle watched from the side of the room, standing with her FBI colleagues. She'd spent countless hours over the past 2 weeks reviewing cases, conducting interviews, and helping shape the department's response. The dark circles under her eyes spoke of long nights and difficult conversations. Effective immediately, the commissioner continued, we're implementing comprehensive reforms. He outlined the changes: mandatory body camera reviews, new training programs, community oversight committees, and a complete overhaul of traffic stop protocols. The room buzzed with whispered conversations as he announced that 6 officers, including Thompson, had been suspended pending further investigation. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement, understanding the necessity of change. A community leader stepped up to speak next. "This isn't about punishment," she said, her voice firm but compassionate. "This is about growth, about learning, about making sure every member of our community feels safe and respected." The screen behind them showed clips from bias training sessions that had already begun. Officers paired with community members, walking through scenarios, learning to recognize and counter unconscious prejudices. The footage showed uncomfortable but necessary conversations happening across conference tables and training rooms. Michelle's phone vibrated in her pocket. Another message from national news outlets wanting to interview her. Her story had sparked something bigger than herself, becoming a catalyst for change not just in this department, but in police departments across the country. "We've established a new civilian review board," the commissioner announced. "Every traffic stop will be logged, reviewed, and analyzed for patterns. Transparency will be our new standard." He gestured to a group of community representatives who would serve on the board, their faces reflecting both determination and hope. The changes weren't just on paper. Physical changes were already visible in the department. New computer systems for tracking stops, updated booking procedures, even a remodeled front desk area designed to be more welcoming to the public. Small changes, perhaps, but symbolic of the larger transformation underway. A young officer raised her hand during the question period. "How do we rebuild trust?" she asked, voicing what many were thinking. The question hung in the air, heavy with importance. The commissioner looked to Michelle, inviting her to answer. She stepped forward, remembering the fear and frustration of that night 2 weeks ago. "Trust," she said, "is rebuilt one interaction at a time. It's rebuilt through accountability, through listening, through changing not just policies but hearts and minds." As the meeting concluded, officers gathered in small groups, discussing the changes. Some looked worried, others determined. Change is never easy, but necessary change is worth the discomfort it brings. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. News crews were setting up for their evening broadcasts, preparing to share the story of a department facing its flaws and working to overcome them. Michelle watched as Officer Thompson walked to his car alone. He stopped, turned, and met her eyes across the lot. There was a moment of understanding between them, both knowing that what had happened that night would ripple out far beyond their own lives, touching countless others and hopefully making a difference for the better. 6 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop, and the changes it sparked were visible everywhere in the police department. The lobby, once stark and intimidating, now featured community artwork and comfortable seating. The walls displayed photographs of officers and residents working together at neighborhood events. Michelle stood at the podium in the Police Academy's main lecture hall, facing a class of fresh-faced recruits. Behind her, a screen showed footage from her own traffic stop, now a powerful teaching tool used in training sessions across the country. "What you're watching isn't just about one night or one officer," she explained, her voice carrying to the back of the room. "It's about the choices we make every day in law enforcement." The recruits watched intently, many taking notes, others shaking their heads at the obvious mistakes being made in the video. The department had transformed in ways both big and small. Every patrol car now had a QR code displayed on its rear window, allowing citizens to instantly access information about their rights and the department's complaint procedures. Body cameras were no longer just worn. They were actively reviewed, analyzed, and used for continuous improvement. "The numbers tell a story," Michelle said, switching to a new slide. Graphs showed dramatic changes in traffic stop patterns. No more clusters in certain neighborhoods. No more questionable justifications. Every stop was logged, reviewed, and analyzed for potential bias. In the back of the room sat Officer Thompson. Now Officer Thompson again, but different. After a 3-month suspension, mandatory training, and community service, he returned to duty with a new perspective. He'd asked to attend these training sessions not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Change isn't just about new policies, Michelle continued, moving through the room. It's about understanding why we do what we do. She shared stories from other departments that had adopted similar reforms, showing how small changes could have big impacts. The classroom discussion was interrupted by a knock at the door. The police commissioner entered, followed by community leaders and representatives from other police departments across the state. They had come to observe what was becoming a model program for police reform. Your experience, the commissioner addressed Michelle, has helped us create real change. He turned to the recruits. What happened that night could have ended very differently. Instead, it became a catalyst for transformation. Outside the academy windows, patrol cars pulled in and out of the parking lot. Each one carried an officer who had gone through the new training program. Each traffic stop they made was now guided by clear protocols and overseen by community review boards. The former head of internal affairs, now retired, had stopped by to share some news. Other departments were reporting similar success with the new programs. The ripple effect was spreading across the country, changing how police departments approach training, accountability, and community relations. But the most important change, Michelle said, wrapping up her presentation, is in how we see each other. She clicked to a final slide showing photos from recent community events. Officers playing basketball with kids, attending neighborhood meetings, building real relationships with the people they served. As the session ended, recruits gathered around to ask questions. One young officer in training raised his hand. "What happened to make the biggest difference?" he asked. Michelle thought for a moment, looking around the room. The answer was everywhere, in the diverse faces of the recruit class, in the community oversight board members sitting in on training, in the transparent walls that had replaced the old barriers between police and public. "The biggest difference," she replied, "was deciding to learn from our mistakes instead of hiding them." She gestured to Officer Thompson, who nodded in agreement. Every difficult moment is a chance to do better, to be better. As the recruits filed out, Michelle gathered her materials. Through the academy windows, she could see the sun setting on another day of change and progress. The incident that could have been just another sad statistic had instead become a turning point. A moment when one traffic stop changed not just a department, but began transforming law enforcement across the nation. The story wasn't over. Real change never is. But each day brought new progress, new understanding, and new hope for a future where law enforcement and community work together as one.